And now please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, today we have one of those biblical passages that tends to give you pause. There are those texts in the Bible where you think to yourself, what is going on here? What am I missing? I'm sure you've had that experience with various parts of the Bible, and this is one of those tough texts. And so it behooves us to take a close look at it and to take it apart. For all you Bible geeks, this is a good sermon for you. Now, the passage starts out, it begins reasonably enough. Jesus, who had been talking to a group of Pharisees, then turns and begins to talk to his disciples. And he tells them a parable. Great. We've been here before. All good. He lays out the story of a rich man and the manager of his vast properties. Apparently, the manager of the properties has been involved in some pretty shady dealings. He has been squandering his master's property. We're not told why or how, but the property manager doesn't deny the accusations against him. He's not, we can be assumed, a very good guy. So the master makes it clear that he's going to fire the manager. Now, these things happen, of course, when you're failing at your job, as he was. And then the manager, afraid of his future prospects, reaches out to those who owe his master money. First, he talks to someone who owes his master a huge, and I mean huge, quantity of olive oil. He tells the debtor to reduce the quantity of oil that he owes to his master from 100 jugs down to 50. Then he talks to someone who owes his master 100 measures of wheat, and then has him rewrite the contract so he owes his master only 80. We can assume that the manager does this with others who also owe things to his master. Now, this is not a minor thing. He's getting the master's debtors to rewrite his debts so that after the manager is fired, they'll treat him well. They might even offer him a job. Okay, so this guy is a dishonest scumbag. We get the picture, Jesus. There were folks like that then, and we know that there are folks like that today. This is where it gets interesting. Because then in verse 8, we hear the master's shocking response to what his manager has been doing. He praises this ne'er-do-well as someone who's acted shrewdly. He does. The master is somehow pleased about his about-to-be-fired manager cheating him of some of his money. This is weird. This is very weird. Now, this has confused commentators for a long time. You're not alone in being perplexed. Now, one thing that people have suggested, these commentators have suggested, is that the manager is not cheating by reducing the amount owed to his master because the amount was interest on a loan. That amount that was reduced was interest on a loan. And the Torah says that charging interest is against God. So the manager, by reducing the amount owed, is following the Torah, being faithful. He lopped off the part that was interest and did a good thing as a result. Hence, he was praised. Another explanation is that the manager is simply reducing the amount by his own commission. In the ancient world, apparently, managers would inflate costs to include the fees for themselves. Perhaps the manager is removing his own fee to earn goodwill of the various people that his master works with. In these ways, he's being shrewd while also being good. The problem is that as much as these interpretations make us feel better about the passage, they're not really in line with what the text says. For starters, the text says that when the manager asked the debtors to change the bill of sale, it says explicitly that he told them to do it quickly. This was something that others couldn't find out about. If the manager was actually being righteous and obeying the Torah's command not to charge interest, would he insist on changing things quickly? This is even more true if all he was doing was removing his own personal commission from the process. Why would it have to be done quickly? Moreover, in the verses that follow, the manager is still explicitly referred to as either being unrighteous or dishonest, depending on how you translate the Greek. Would he be considered unrighteous or dishonest if he was merely obeying the Torah or eliminating his own take? Also, the amount that the manager reduced the first debtor's debt by, 50%, is not realistic either for interest charged or for the extent of someone's commission. It doesn't line up. The manager was shown to be dishonest again and again. So what do we do with this text? The simplest answer is to take it at face value. The dishonest manager is, well, dishonest. He cheated the manager before, then he reduces the manager's take to benefit himself by winning favor with the various merchants that he deals with to get a job for himself afterwards. Then his master, when he sees what happened, honestly commends the scoundrel. I mean, it's like, well done, cheater. I mean, you did the smartest thing with what you had. You're still losing your job, but you sure were shrewd. Then comes the key lines. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. In other words, those of this world, like the dishonest manager, are better at getting along in the world than the children of light, i.e., Christians. Without a doubt, the children of this world know how to maximize the ways of this world. They realistically assess the way things are. It turns out that behavior is, far too often, effective. Christians tend to be bad at shrewdly operating in the world. The question is what to do with the next line. Again, this passage is not easy. And I tell you, excuse me, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it's gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. That line is a doozy. Make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth. Is that really what Jesus wants us to do? Really? We're supposed to use dishonest wealth to buy off people to be our friends? Some commentators, who are understandably disturbed by this suggestion of Jesus, have tried to soften the blow by focusing on the last word. The final words in this verse, which the NRSV, our translation, translates as eternal homes, are actually eternal tents. Perhaps those who effectively use dishonest wealth won't end up in eternal homes, but in the far less attractive eternal tents. They'll be second-class citizens in the world to come, nomads in the land of eternity. Now, while this is an intriguing suggestion, it overstates the implications of the word tents. Tents do not have a pejorative, a negative sense in the Bible. Rather than implying that there are different levels in the world to come, something that we don't find evidence for in the Bible, it more likely applies something about the nature of eternity. In the eternal realm, we'll be like the Israelites in the wilderness, wholly dependent on God in our eternal tents, following the God by a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. And the verses that follow reinforce the notion that we should use what we have, even if it's dishonest wealth, as best we can. Verse 11 reads, "If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches?" Dishonest wealth is the way of the world. We can't reject it simply because it's dishonest. Even dishonest wealth, if we have it, must be used the best way we can. Only then will we be entrusted with the true riches. You can see why this passage has disturbed so many Christians over time. The dishonest manager is being lifted up and praised for shrewdly using the time he has before getting fired to build up goodwill at his master's expense. The children of this world, those who know how to work the system, should be models for us. I have to be honest, after thinking about it a lot, I actually can appreciate what Jesus is saying here. It's not what we typically think of as Jesus-like, but the passage does have some crucial wisdom for us. So often among Christians, there is this instinct to seek moral purity. We look around and try and find the best action that we can. Christians are often critical of any option that is not morally pure. Now, striving after moral good conduct is obviously good. But the reality is that we live in a morally ambiguous world. If we think we're morally pure, we're deluding ourselves. The most obvious example, at least given our context here in Houston, is what we do with the fossil fuel industry. There are those environmentalists who are dead set against any and all fossil fuel production. It must end tomorrow. It is dishonest wealth. We should have no part of it. Fossil fuels contribute to global warming, and our planet is, without a doubt, warming. We're already seeing the devastating consequences of our love for fossil fuels. California has been beset by droughts, wildfires, and now flash flooding, all of which can be attributed to global warming. The fossil fuel industry also puts money in the hands of a lot of bad actors around the globe. Oil has led to corruption and inequality in places like Nigeria and Angola. And most troubling these days, fossil fuel earnings are funding Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine. It is tempting to swear off all fossil fuels. They are evil, sinful. But that supposedly morally pure stance avoids confronting some harsh truths. Fossil fuels are a relatively cheap form of energy, and our contemporary world desperately needs energy. If we swore off all fossil fuels, those in developing countries would be hit the hardest. Developing countries need access to affordable energy for their economic development. We have to balance the negative impact of global warming with the very real consequences of underdevelopment in the developing world. It's easy to sit in a place like the United States, where our standard of living has been immensely improved because of fossil fuels, and to judge poorer countries if they seek to use those same fuels to benefit themselves. Moreover, as we're discovering now in Ukraine, fossil fuels are essential for the production of nitrogen-based fertilizers. Those fertilizers are what has allowed the human population to explode over the latter half of the 20th century. Until we come up with another means of cheaply producing vast amounts of fertilizer, the elimination of fossil fuels would lead to mass starvation across the globe. And there's the reality that all of us, and I mean all of us, are far more dependent on fossil fuels than we care to admit. The plane travel produces lots of carbon. Not good. Should we stop flying planes? Our globalized economy means that we buy goods cheaply from all around the globe. Any store we go to. All those nice cheap things, where do they come from? Probably not near us. We rely on container ships that use fossil fuels, trains that use fossil fuels, and an immense fleet of trucks that move goods all over the country. Will you buy only things that are produced locally and produced in a handmade fashion? I could go on, but I think you get the point. Jesus is telling us to be faithful in small things. Let us use dishonest wealth as best we can in our morally ambiguous world. Yes, 100%. We should seek to reduce our use of plastics. 100%. Be faithful in small things. Yes, installing solar panels on your roof is a great idea. Do that. Yes, electric cars are the way of the future and will vastly reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. But let us not be fooled into seeking total moral purity. That's not possible. Do the best we can with what we have. That seems to be in this passage what Jesus would want. But there's another reason why Jesus' advice in this passage is so meaningful. Yes, it forces us to be honest about the morally ambiguous nature of the world. We are not pure, our world is not pure, and it's not likely to be. Being honest about that matters. Another important takeaway from Jesus' words is that we should not disengage from the world merely because it is morally ambiguous. Simply because we are not morally pure does not mean we shouldn't strive to do the best we can with what we have, to be faithful in small things. Years ago, when I worked as the undergraduate chaplain at Harvard, I often advised students on their academics and also on their job search process. At the time, two of the preferred job opportunities were in management consulting and investment banking. Particularly in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, investment banking did not have a good reputation. Greedy Wall Street bankers were behind much of the mess in credit default swaps and mortgage-backed securities. Without a doubt, there were a lot of bad actors in the finance industry. At the same time, finance offered lucrative salaries and promising careers for many Harvard undergraduates. And time and again, I would talk to students who would sheepishly say that they were selling out by accepting internships or jobs at investment banks. I usually reacted quite strongly to their language of selling out. To me, it was a way for them to release themselves of any moral responsibility once they got into the finance industry. Since they already sold out, why should they care about being moral in their industry? They should just go along to get along. I told them that there were a lot of great reasons to go into finance. It could provide for themselves and for their families. The finance industry is also crucial for economic development. Like with fossil fuels, there is not a world without finance. What I pushed them to do was to be good moral bankers. That's precisely what we needed. We needed people with a good moral compass in that industry. We needed folks who would name the bad practices within the industry. Furthermore, once these students made money, I wanted them to use that money for good. Money itself is morally neutral. What we do with our money determines its morality. That's precisely what Jesus tells us at the conclusion of our passage for this morning. We can't make wealth our God without moral consequences. That leads to all sorts of bad things, like the 2008 financial crisis. But you can use wealth for good ends, and we need people to do just that. When we insist that everything in life is morally pure when it's not, we're tempted to absolve ourselves of moral responsibility. What Jesus is telling us here, or at least what I think he's telling us here, is that we have to use even dishonest wealth as best we can. In so doing, we are trying to move the world toward the kingdom of God. Now, there is one final other important lesson that I take from this passage. As I've said, we need to be honest about the morally ambiguous nature of the world. We cannot and should not claim moral purity. Moreover, simply because we live in a morally ambiguous world, that does not absolve us from our responsibility to act morally as best we can. We must use even dishonest wealth towards good ends. The final lesson comes from our good friend, this dishonest manager. What forces the dishonest manager to act shrewdly is his fear of the future. His boss makes it clear that he's going to get fired. There is an urgency to his actions, an urgency made all the more significant by the emotions that he's feeling. In this case, his fear of the future. We live in a morally ambiguous world. We have to engage the world and act morally as best we can in spite of imperfect circumstances. But it's our emotions that present us with the final challenge of how we act in the world. Let's be honest, acting morally, being our best selves, as we would all like, is far easier in an environment that's void of emotion. It's great to come here on Sunday morning to have time for quiet prayer and reflection and be inspired by the music or even the sermon. Hopefully we feel more grounded, more connected with God as a result of Sunday worship. The challenge is to act morally when we don't feel grounded in God, when we're not feeling at peace. So often we're overwhelmed by emotions of one form or another. Now, as many of you know, I'm not generally known for my punctuality. I try to fit far too many things into my day, and I often find myself rushing to the next appointment. In the process, I get angry with myself for not allowing more time. But there's always so much to do, and so doing that can be hard. It's precisely these moments when I feel rushed and full of self-recrimination over my tardiness that I can be less charitable to others, particularly when driving on the streets of Houston. Now, I don't think I'm a bad driver. I'm just a very Boston driver. I drive with intention. But I get impatient with others who have less urgency to get where they're going. Now, that might be a trivial example of how emotion obscures our best behavior, but there are plenty of other examples. What happens when there is someone in your life who has done you wrong in some form or another? That person has a beef with you or someone you love. Those past slights weigh on you, and they heighten your emotions whenever you think of the person. And in such circumstances, it can be hard to love that person, to be Christian toward that person. Those emotions get in the way. Does that sound familiar? I'd imagine each of you actually have someone in your mind you can think of right now who fits into that category. Then, like the dishonest manager, of course, is also the fear of the future and the emotion that brings. You're scared about your future career. Something has happened at your place of work. Tensions run high. Anxiety seems ever present around you. That is just when it can be hardest to act morally in our morally ambiguous world. That fear, that emotion, of course, can also be present here in church. This past week has been an emotional week for me. Last Sunday, I stood before the congregation that I grew up in, the church I grew up in, and accepted their call to be their next senior minister. It was the very same place where I was baptized when I was 4 years old, and I remember that moment. It's the same spot where I was confirmed, same spot where I was ordained, and I couldn't help but think of an image of my father, his body riddled with cancer as he placed a stole over my neck, symbolizing my call to ordained ministry. He would die not long after. All of those things were going through my mind as I stood there in that spot. Then, of course, I had to return to Houston and send out my letter of resignation to this congregation that I've so dearly loved. My emotions have been all over the place this past week, and I'm sure it's been an emotional week for many of you. There is uncertainty about the future. Think of all the incredible memories that we've shared here. All of those things come up, heighten our emotions. It's precisely at times like these when I appreciate Jesus' words to be faithful in small things. Our emotions can cloud our actions. This week, I found myself being angry or worked up over things that should not have bothered me. In our text, Jesus says to take it one step at a time. Be faithful in small things. When you feel overwhelmed, take a deep breath and focus on the Holy Spirit coming in and out with each breath. That has been such a blessing, that advice, this past week. It's fun being a preacher because when you read through a text, you're always somehow preaching to yourself. Our reading in Luke 16 is a complex one. It's one that forces us to read the text closely and try and figure out what Jesus is really saying. We live in a complex world. It is not morally pure or perfect. But it's precisely because we live in such a world that we must be faithful in the situations that God presents us with. It's the small steps, the small acts of faith that can see us through. How can we be better stewards of the environment in small things, even though we know we're not in a position to swear off fossil fuels? How can you be faithful in small things, especially when our emotions run high, when it's hard to be our best selves? What can you do today to grow in compassion and love? In short, the question Jesus leaves us with is, how can you be Christian now and in the uncertain times that lie ahead?